haven't beaten is Stalin, and that's only because he basically said take everybody away. But the most notorious court of Adolf Hitler had a conviction rate of 90%. We're at 99. I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, the federal government can never be wrong about anybody at any time. So it really gets to be scary.
I want to move on to another issue that's confronting the markets, not only last year, but looks like a carryover in this year. And that has been the sovereign debt crisis. We've seen in Europe the December 9th agreement to cede sovereignty. I guess as you look at this crisis unfold, do you believe that Germany will stick to its hard line, or will the politicians and bureaucrats, in order to preserve the euro, will Germany blink if it means saving the euro in the end?
According to very high sources I have in Germany, if the choice comes between the collapse of the euro or blinking and letting inflation take place, they will take the latter. They have so much invested in this euro. It's pathetic that there, too, they simply will not do the right thing. I mean, as a trader, I warned them back in 97. Look, if you're going to leave every country with its own individual bonds, if you short the bonds, you basically have a virtual currency. It's just a derivative. That's it. The only way to have actually created a single currency was like the United States. You had to create a single national debt. Can you imagine what the national debt of this country would be if all 50 states had the right to issue federal debt? I mean, it would be total chaos. But that's what Europe has got. And largely because the politicians, I mean, the two words that should have been divorced the moment they met was basically political economy, because they don't know what they're doing. Most of them are lawyers, and they have done a fantastic job of always screwing up everything every step of the way. And Europe, unfortunately, is in the same boat, and it's gotten worse now, where before, if you thought Greece was in bad shape, you sold the currency. It actually devalued the debt. Now what happens is, because the currency is the euro, you have to sell the bonds. So you sell the bonds, and what happens is that the interest rates not go up. What we're really facing this year, and remarkably doesn't seem to be anybody talking about it yet, but there are 600 billion euros that have to be rolled, and that's just Spain and Italy this year. You're rolling from interest rates of 1.5% to 2% to 7%. So everywhere we look, the national debt of just about everybody around, it's just going to go exponentially higher. So this is why the countries are getting very aggressive with their taxation. I believe that historically you're going to see more and more people hoard money and not really invest. It's just everything they could possibly do wrong, they are doing.
We've seen, Martin, a lot of protest, whether we've seen it here in the States, Greece, the Middle East. And governments, I would think, have to look with trepidation at events in the Middle East where a rebellion used social media to bring the rebellion together and to get organized. There is a recent bill that was introduced into the Senate by Senator Joseph Lieberman and Susan Collins. It's called Protecting Cyberspace. Essentially, they're under the guise of a terrorist attack. It gives them the ability to shut down communications and the Internet. Shouldn't that also be a warning in terms of the steps government is taking? It seems like, Martin, they sort of have a sense that this is coming. In other words, people will only sit back and be a slave for so long before the slaves eventually revolt.
Yeah, I mean, they know it. They proposed that within months of watching what happened in the Middle East. And, I mean, I'm a programmer. You cannot attack every server in this country simultaneously. You can maybe attack one server, you can attack the government, but you unplug those. You don't unplug the entire Internet. And this is what the president now, that's what they want the power to do, which will basically shut down all the social media. But it will also shut down where the free press is. Everybody turns to the Internet for radio, for all these things. This will all be shut off on a blink of an eye if the government just doesn't like it. And they can always now claim it's some terrorist. And, I mean, these 19 guys in a camel, I'll tell you, they've taken away all our rights where World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, none of those standing armies could have done what 19 guys in a camel did.
I want to move on to something that we're seeing play out in the economy, and I'd like to get your explanation for our listeners. On one hand, we have, it looks like, two opposing forces at work. We have deleveraging taking place in the private sector, and we've seen that steadily since the crisis in 2007. And yet we have monetary and fiscal expansion on the side of the government, which is inflationary. So it seems like, Martin, we have a battle between the forces of inflation and deflation occurring simultaneously. And looking at the economic numbers and even the inflation rate, what we've got in its place is stagflation.
Yes, it's hard to get a full bead on the amount of deflation we're going through. I would put it at very bare minimum at $15 trillion, and that is basically the lowering of asset values across the board. So, I mean, if you look at just the real estate market, the outstanding mortgages were about $15 trillion. So if you really just want to look at that, there's, a third off of that, you're talking $5 trillion. So the Fed increasing the monetary supply through its elastic facilities, you're talking about a little less than $3 trillion. That's why there was no real inflation. QE1 and 2 really did not stimulate. They can't pump in enough money, basically, to fix it the way they've done. What they should have done, which would have been much simpler, is forget their friends and relatives in the banking community. They should have basically just taken all the mortgages across the board and just say, okay, fine, we're chopping them by 25%, and let the government pay up for that. That would have done a heck of a lot more for the economy because, number one, it would have prevented all these massive foreclosures, which essentially affects everybody because what happens is so much housing comes on the market that your house, even if you're fully paid up, depreciates in value because of the supply that's out there to be sold. And the banks have absolutely done a terrible job at this. They didn't pay attention really what they were doing. They started pooling all these mortgages together. And I can tell you that anybody that has had any kind of a problem with not being able to pay their mortgage or whatever, all they really have to do is say, if somebody tries to foreclose, give me the certified copy of the mortgage. Because once they pooled these things, then they sliced them and diced them, nobody knew who actually owned what. So that's why you have some people being able to stay in houses for 3 years. And they're getting basically rent-free and whatever, largely because they pulled these things together that never should have been done. And they go to the government with their hat in hand and ask for $700 billion to bail themselves out, not the economy that hasn't done anything for anybody other than make, the bankers rich again. That's about it.
As we look at these opposing forces that we've been talking about here, deflation, inflation, this leads me to gold and how gold has performed. In September, Martin, it looked like as it crossed over 1,900, it was on its way to 2,000. Instead, it ended the year below 1,600. Now, you believe the market has the possibility in the gold market to retest the 1,225 to 1,325 area going into this year. What would be the catalyst for this move downward, in your opinion?
It's largely this battle between the inflation and deflation. I don't see the inflationary pressure currently. We are still burdened more with a deflationary contraction still, but that probably will start to, I would think, reverse maybe this summer. After the summer, it will start to begin to percolate back up a little bit in the inflationary side, largely because we have so much debt rolling over that the interest expenditures are going to go up in Europe and elsewhere. And I think that we're going to see that a lot more of capital tends to be hoarded. And if you're going to be looking at hoarding, cash at this point in time, you certainly don't want to do it in cash in a bank per se. So I do think that people will tend to look a little bit more at the metals, particularly gold, later on in 2012, more in the second half. So I think that, we're going to have to really be concerned about the way the government is moving in every single direction here, with taxation, with cutting off the internet, with authorizing domestic activity, with military. I mean, all this is pointing in one direction, that they know that they have trouble coming. And historically, even in fashions, whatever appears in Europe, it just takes, 1 or 2 years for it to pop up over here. So the other thing that we really have a problem with, which is similar to the Great Depression, is that what people don't realize is that you really have to pay attention to what was the unemployment at that point in time. Unemployment really was about what it is today. It really only went up to slightly below 10% from the financial market side. What came in as a second punch and drove unemployment to 25% was largely after the lows were in place, going into 1935, etc. The reason for that was the Dust Bowl. And 40% of the civil workforce at the time were farmers. So you could not pass a law to make it rain. So it was the final stage of the Industrial Revolution that forced people out of the agricultural sector and into becoming skilled labor. So by the time you get to 1980, the agricultural sector was only 8%. We are in the same similar situation today, except for that 40% figure of the civil workforce is employed by government. And this is a bit worse in the sense that they do not really contribute anything to economic growth. That's why we call them public servants. It's like hiring a maid in your house, and it's very nice, but she's going to cost you money. She's not making it so that you can earn more. And a public servant is basically the same thing. It's a cost of living. Although the government doesn't put it in the CPI indexes, it is part of our cost of living. And 40% of the civil workforce is employed by government. So as government is rising in cost exponentially, this is a great problem, because the state and local governments are going to be forced into more and more layoffs, etc., because they can't print money like the feds can. So you're going to see more bankruptcies, etc. So the unemployment we see going forward is largely becoming from the public sector rather than the private sector. And so unemployment is going to go up rather significantly.